Hello, yeah, so how did I first start to get creative, when I got sober? It's a question that I kind of spend a lot of time talking about with other people who are at an earlier stage of their own recovery journey. Before I got sober from all drugs, including alcohol, over 5 years ago now, creativity to me meant that I would get completely off my face and try and do something productive with my time. More often than not, I didn't end up doing anything creative, and when I did, it was uninspired. It was not very good. It was more a reaction to something than me trying to be productive. And nowadays, creativity really genuinely means, I get to connect with something spiritual. I get to connect with something greater than me. I get to focus deeply on expressing myself, and I don't need any drink or drugs to get me going, and that's a really beautiful thing. And that's the message I want to share today, is firstly that we don't need drink and drugs to be creative. And in fact, in my case, they're actually getting in the way of my creativity. And secondly, that I understand that a lot of people struggle to create when they first get into recovery. But there are, a few things that I used to do and a few things that really helped me along the way in my early journey, which I think can be helpful to other people as well. I always used to feel like my art came from the substances that I consumed. All my heroes were addicts as well, that's the truth. And whilst they were incredibly talented, they also used to use a lot of drugs and alcohol. And, most of them committed suicide or died or, overdosed or whatever. So it's not exactly a recipe for success. And I used to feel like I needed substances in my body. Firstly, to feel comfortable in my own skin, but secondly, to be a creative person. I used to have this impression in my mind that if you didn't use a lot of drugs or alcohol to, get into the zone, then you weren't a real artist or you weren't a real creative person. And I realise now that's just a fallacy. That's the wrong way of thinking about it. And that kind of thinking kept me sick for a really long time. My art now comes from me, and it comes through me from, call it whatever you want, the universe or the muse, or people call it God as well, It's authentically me, It's not hidden underneath a load of alcohol or a load of drugs that I felt like I needed to take just to feel normal, to create something. When I was early in recovery, and this is something I think people struggle with a lot, is inspiration. I was so wrapped up in getting well, and helping myself and learning about myself now that I was leading this new lifestyle that didn't involve me drinking and using drugs most days, that I didn't really know what to be creative about. I didn't have any inspiration, and I didn't really have a creative practice as such. I was so out of the loop. And I found that all of my creative work early doors was about the journey that I was on. It was about recovery. It was about what my life used to be like when I was using alcohol and drugs all the time, compared to what it's like after I decided to stop those things. And that would be my first piece of advice, really, is like, if you are one of those people who is newly in recovery or thinking about cutting down or stopping alcohol and drugs because you think that it's interfering with your creativity, then that would be my advice, is just to lean into your own journey, lean into where you're at and express yourself authentically, because when we decide to make that decision, it's more often than not such a life-altering decision. It's a really big step. It's a really positive change that we're deciding to make for ourselves and hopefully for our loved ones as well. That there's so much material, you don't have to go digging or searching far and wide for inspiration about subject matter or types of songs you want to write or stories or anything along those lines. It doesn't matter what kind of creative you are. All your inspiration is within you, and you can access that at any time, and quite freely, I found. So when I first stopped using drugs and drinking, I used to journal a lot every day, and not about anything in particular, but just about what was going on for me, what I'd been up to that day, how I was feeling on my own recovery journey, because putting things down on paper with a pen is really helpful. And then from there, I used to draw these little cartoons. I used to imagine little scenes in my head about what my life used to be like and what it is currently like. And you know what? I found that everything I did was autobiographical, and there's really nothing wrong with that. And in fact, it's a really good place to start. It's a really beautiful way to access your creativity, I find, when we are new to recovery. Other things that were really crucial in this early journey, you know, when learning how to create whilst in recovery, were, you know, building connections, both in real life and online, with other people who share the same experiences. You know, one part of my addiction that was really prevalent was this, you know, real, I felt this real need to isolate myself all the time. One, because I was ashamed of what I was doing. Two, because I didn't really want people around me more often than not. And three, because it kept me away from the love and the community that is really out there if you start to look and you put the effort in. And even in recovery, you know, I find that one of my go-to kind of like quote unquote negative traits or ways of acting out is this self-isolation, you know, keeping myself to myself, you know, not connecting with people. Instead of, you know, facing my problems, I tend to run away from them and just lock myself away, you know. And so early recovery, it's all about building connections and finding like-minded people, other creative people who are on the same path as you, who struggle with substances, who, you know, are trying to fix themselves in some way or another, because that's the path that we're all on. In my experience, creative growth as an artist in recovery is slow, but it's meaningful, and it's driven by a deep sense of purpose now. And even today, 5.5 years into this journey, a lot of my work is driven by my own experience of the world and my own experience of being in recovery. And yeah, it's just about the way that I navigate, you know, the life of a recovering addict, you know. It's great material, it is, you know, and even on the darkest days, I know that I've got stuff that I can use to express myself. And to end, I suppose, how do we create when we're in sobriety or, you know, in recovery, or trying to make that decision? It gets said a lot, but it's true. It's small daily actions, you know, they compound over time. And one thing I would recommend is getting a daily practice, whether it's a daily 5-minute reflection practice or a journal entry or even a little sketch. You know, when I was first in recovery, I had this tiny little sketchbook. It was like, you know, probably A6, if that makes any sense to you. It's like a quarter of the size of a regular sheet of paper. And I used to take that everywhere with me because it would fit in my pocket. You know, and I take one pen and, you know, no eraser and nothing like that, just a pen. And I would either write or I would draw little cartoons of people, or I would, you know, just whatever was on my mind would go into that book. And that is a really helpful way to start to get back into that creative mindset when we are new in recovery, because I appreciate that it's not easy. Yeah, if these little bits of advice have spoke to you, then please let me know. Leave me a comment, subscribe if you feel so inclined to do so. I'm really on a mission to help other people, other artists who are curious about recovery or are currently in recovery but not feeling very inspired creatively. So if you feel like you fit into one of those boxes, then do let me know, and you can expect more of the same. It's something that means a lot to me, and this kind of path is revealing itself to me now, and it's speaking to me well, it's speaking to me really strongly, you know, and I feel very much drawn to this idea of helping other people who are perhaps a couple of steps behind where I used to be at. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.